So thank you very much, and if I have no other talents, the talent to negotiate my way into first position rather than last speaker for the conference is one that I'm pleased with myself about. Thanks very much for the invitation to contribute to this session and the dialogue about being a broader, smarter, better 21st century public service. I was invited to speak of all those roles you just heard about at this conference as a member of the COAG Reform Council, a body I joined in 2008 in the early years of its establishment. And what I'm intending to do in the presentation is to comment on the extent to which the current COAG reform agenda, together with the IGA on federal financial relations and the establishment of the COAG Reform Council itself, have led to reforms that are broader, smarter and better, and then based on our recent review of the first 5 years of progress, offer some suggestions about how progress could be better in the future and the skills public servants might need to possess in order to make things better in the future. I've also chosen to focus on the issue of federalism because there's a current refocusing of interest on this area, driven by the Commission of Audit, whose first report's due in January 2014. The Commission has indicated it will look specifically at roles and responsibilities of government, as well as the promised white paper in federalism that's due within the first 2 years of the first term of the Abbott government. And of course, next month we have the prospect of the first COAG reform, or the COAG meeting, I beg your pardon, with Prime Minister Abbott in the chair. The new government has indicated that it wants to shape federal-state relations along the lines of the original intent of the IGA on federal financial relations, drawing attention to the need to be clear about roles and responsibility and devolving responsibility to the states. Hence, it's timely to reflect on what we've learned from the recent reform wave and what there is to learn from it. The core business of the COAG Reform Council is to report on the progress of the COAG Reform Council. It does this in two ways: by reporting both on the progress of reform activity, by answering the question, did we meet a milestone, but also on progress towards agreed targets. So that's reporting on outcomes. The Council, as you know, is an independent reporting body funded by all governments. Until the mid-2000s, if you think back, COAG's major reforms had been in the area of economic policy. It had dealt with economic issues such as national competition policy and GST. But this current agenda embodies a broader approach. It still covers competition and regulatory reforms through the Seamless National Economy Agreement, and that final report is due in February 2014. But it's also moved in the last 5 years firmly into the social policy areas of education, skills, Indigenous reform, health, disability, housing and homelessness. So we have to say that the current reform agreement is broad. The breadth of the reform agenda has not always been welcomed, however, by stakeholders throughout the period of this agreement. There were frequent calls from stakeholders, particularly the Business Council, to narrow the focus of the reform agenda. So is broader better? The recognition that many policy levers beyond pure economic levers have an impact on people's productivity and the productivity of the country is good. It's good to be broad. It's good to recognise that we get greater productivity through agendas beyond workplace and taxation reforms. But it's also true that in forming the agenda, there did not appear to be sufficient emphasis on understanding the program logic of some of the reforms. Program logic gives people confidence about how large the potential benefits are and when they might be delivered. There's also some argument for narrowing the agenda to those reforms that are expected to have the largest impact over the medium term. A future reform agenda needs to recognise the breadth of levers, so it needs to be broad about the levers that can be pulled, but it also needs to prioritise effort, and it doesn't need to prioritise effort in favour of the squeakiest wheel, the people who are calling loudest for it. As you know, at the outset, all governments agreed to the reforms of COAG, and our recent review of the first 5 years concluded that significant progress has been achieved, and that was done with some independent work by Ernst & Young as well. At the same time as agreeing the reform agenda, COAG agreed a new approach to federal financial relations, a smarter approach based on cooperative federalism. The Intergovernmental Agreement, or the IGA as it's known, is a framework that supports the agenda. It's about shared goals, but with innovation on the ways and means to achieve these goals. It replaced a very prescriptive approach with the Commonwealth funding linked to inputs. And as we all know, prescriptive approaches stifle responsiveness and increase administrative burden. The IGA was said at the time to be the most significant reform of Australia's federal financial relations in decades. It was designed to support the reform agenda by clarifying roles and responsibilities, something that we seem to be doing again, giving the state and territory governments greater flexibility to innovate, and enhancing the accountability of governments for their performance on achieving agreed reforms. And this is where the COAG Reform Council comes in. In my view, the existence of developing roles of independent reporting authorities is very important. It's important because by publishing data on progress and comparative performance of agencies and states, this provides an excellent driver to understand why some states and some institutions perform better than others and to incentivise the adoption of better practice. In addition, the reporting agencies themselves, to perform their own task, they put pressure to drive greater data quality and greater access to the very rich data sources that exist in administrative data collections, and hence they drive evidence-based policy. A smarter public service needs to collect data efficiently, to mine data for insights, and to use insights to provide efficient and effective policy and program advice. The review that we did found that our council's performance reporting was hindered by the quality of measures and indicators that had been set for us to report on, and calls for improvement in establishment of better and more robust performance frameworks. The reform agenda of the nature that was taken on, coupled with the new funding framework, challenged conventional thinking and practice, and in turn challenged the business models that governments use to do business. I clearly remember the howls of protest, signalling great discomfort at the new ways of working. Line agencies felt most displaced as First Minister's departments got into the driving seats in negotiating reform agreements. Commonwealth agencies felt the heat as they joined the group who were being monitored rather than being the monitors, and they shied away at times from the attempts that were made to loosen the reporting and control requirements. The IGA was a watershed reform in describing the way in which Commonwealth-state relations should be conducted. It was smarter than before, but it hasn't been fully adhered to throughout the life of the agreement. Our review revealed that shareholders believe that having COAG involved certainly helped the agenda and initial progress was good, but that stakeholders believe that the pace of reform slowed over the 5 years of its implementation. And why? Some people offer the excuse of the GFC. From my perspective, all of this required a change in culture, and the culture moving from being the compliance culture to the collaborative culture was very difficult to achieve. Was that ring? Thank you. So we have had over time a challenge of culture. The Council also found that the responsibilities and the governance by COAG of the agenda wasn't as good as it should be, and that COAG needs to, if it's going to move forward on a reform agenda, close the accountability loop by regularly reviewing progress on the agenda and setting new directions. It needs to schedule regular meetings, and it needs to schedule to ensure the agenda priorities for COAG meetings are set both by the Commonwealth and the state. In conclusion, the COAG Reform Council has a unique role in federal-state relations. We help the public hold the 9 Australian governments accountable for implementing reforms that they've agreed to. We are independent, we report directly to COAG, and we're funded 50% by the Commonwealth and 50% by the state. After decades of complaint about the way our federation works, we now have another opportunity to improve the federal system. We can be the generation that leaves behind a legacy of a better functioning, smarter working federation that is committed to broader-based economic and social reform. A smarter, broader, better 21st century public service must make our federation work. It mustn't start again. It must build on the lessons that we've had from the current wave of reform. And if we can't do this, Australians will be condemning themselves to more decades of overlap, duplication, blame shifting, cost shifting at the expense of the possible improvements in both productivity and wellbeing for all Australians. Thank you.
This is the end of 4 days for me in Canberra. I've met literally, I think, probably hundreds of people and been in meetings with Commission of Audit and people in lots of government departments and so on. And it's been an amazingly intense, exciting period. And I would sort of offer a kind of few reflections around this theme of better, smarter, broader. I mean, the two things people all keep asking about the UK is tell us about the cuts and tell us about contestability, because we think we're in for some of each. I'm not going to dwell on the cuts, talked about that a bit earlier today. I mean, just to kind of state the point. So again, 25% real terms cut in all spend at all levels of government in public services. 500,000 jobs have gone in the last 2 years. There's some more to go, so big cuts. 50% cuts in central government, 35% cuts in kind of local government. So this is a big deal. The only thing I would just say is all those services have got better. That's what all the indicators say. It's interesting. Actually, the British public has kind of got behind it. And that's because people are doing intelligent, reforming things that are making a difference. It's not all perfect, but it's interesting. So let's turn to contestability instead and just talk about that. I mean, nobody ever knows what it means. So I fear what it can mean is an old-fashioned debate about public and private. 2 legs good, 4 legs bad. What should we do with all those public servants? Should we bring the private sector in? I don't think any of us would like to kind of go down that route. My sense of contestability is a slightly different discussion, which is, I think in the public service, and I've certainly found this talking to colleagues in the last few days, there's too much debate about how should we, as public servants, go about our responsibilities for everybody else. How should we do this? How should we change the way that we do it? We are responsible for everything. It'll all go wrong if we don't do it right. And not enough questioning, I think, really, about why should we be responsible for things and who should maybe take control instead of us. And I think that's what kind of opens up the route to doing things differently. So I can't imagine a conference called Private Sector Reform Conference, come and get your tickets, actually. So given that that's, you can't imagine that, let's just kind of, think it through. I've got a few kind of little maxims to kind of throw out there. Maybe they're kind of paradoxes. One is, I think the route to being more powerful in government is to give power away. It's putting your power in the hands of the right people. So things that I think are exciting in the UK at the moment are empowering individuals, giving people the cash for services to go and buy them themselves, just as though they were kind of the richest people in the country, giving the poorest people the money to do what they want, education, health, care, childcare. That's really exciting. That feels like you're enabling someone to do something. And that's where the money drops out. So, in the old world, when public sector did home care for the elderly itself, £28 an hour. When it was put out into the market and was competed, £14 an hour. Big step forward. When you give people the money themselves, they spend £8 an hour. And the carer always got £8. That I think, tells you something about different ways of doing it. And actually, the moving stories of people with disabilities who've now got control, the dignity they feel about who they choose to come into their homes and work with them intimately, that really feels like a different world. That feels like it was worth giving the power away. Decentralising power. I mentioned local government in Britain getting cuts, 35%. This is for real services, it's for social services, it's for kind of transport, it's for social housing, etc. 35% cuts. Do you know why people have taken that mission? Because they've actually been freed up. There used to be 90 separate sources of funding to those people. Now they have 2 or 3, one of which is 80 or 90% of the money. So difficulties passed to other people, they make good use of the opportunity because they care. They care about themselves as individuals, they care about themselves as local communities. Opening up choice to providers, saying to people, if you get people back into work and they stay there, you earn a lot of money. If you don't get people back in, if they don't stay and work for a year, you don't get a penny. And you have NGOs emotionally trying to blackmail politicians as they go bankrupt, but they don't work. Why should they get the money? And then you get new people coming along and tackling some of the hardest needs and earning a good reward for doing so. I think giving power away gets you a long way. The second thing that I would say is, how do you empower those who you're empowering? It's not about just kind of giving up and saying over to you. How do you help? Transparency, using modern technology to get information out to people and allowing them to kind of be able to take this control and to kind of do good things with it. So seeing now in the UK how we're going through a program of every single surgeon having that person's clinical records captured, put out into the public domain. It's transforming professional practice between doctors. It's out there, and people are beginning to choose not which hospital but which doctor they go to on the basis of that data. So I think transparency is a kind of rich opportunity. Actually recognising that some people will need help. So in the UK now, money follows your choice of school. Anyone can open a school. We've opened a school in kind of inner city London as KPMG. Anybody can. The money follows the kids. But actually, very importantly, a lot more money follows the poorest kids because they won't necessarily be the most attractive. But in resource terms, they really are. So kind of helping people who might otherwise not be helped, critical. And sure, there are some groups who you can't trust and you can't give control to. So one of the things David Cameron has done is to say, I'm sick of this academic debate about the 100,000 most troubled families who consume 30% of the resources. I'd like their names. And actually we did that. We made every one of 200 local authorities. All the agencies come together, decide on the names that made up the 100,000, their addresses. Every one of those families has now got a kind of family manager who is the gateway to all programs and all spend. They will take over all the budgets for those families. That is kind of making a difference. So I think empowering those who we empower, it's not about just kind of giving up, is critical. The third thing that I'd emphasise is it's always too easy to come to conferences like this and talk about how do we all innovate? How are we all different? What is our local way? What's our pride? Well, do you know, one of the things I learned going to the private sector was that the biggest thing you do is copy other people's success. You have massive incentives if somebody else is doing something good to copy it, because if you don't get any work. And actually copying other people's success is actually, watch what goes on with mobile phones every day. That's kind of what happens in the economy. So actually less innovation, less variation. A simple fact on the cost. If in public services across your country, people doing the same thing, if the average cost, the mean average cost, moved to the current 25th percentile, I guarantee you would save 20 to 30% of the cost of running those services. Okay. That's not inventing something different, weird, unusual, risky, just copying the people who are doing it well. That's got to kind of be easier. And it allows you to learn not just from public services, but for tax and benefits departments, to learn from what people do in banks and insurance, copy others. It's a good idea, I think. At the heart of that, though, is accepting something important about ourselves, which is that I would say only 1% of people working in publicly funded jobs are unique and special to government. They're the kind of inner sanctum mandarins, no doubt, in places like Canberra, but very small numbers of them, even here, close to ministers running the political process, that think they are different. Everybody else, somebody else is doing a job like yours out there in the kind of wider economy. And that I think is an important message. So I would say, what is the point of a public service reform conference like this year and in future years? Why is it important? I think it is because there's one common question that we all share, which is asking ourselves as individuals that kind of quite simple question about, am I here to take responsibility for other people and worry about them all getting it wrong if I don't put the controls in place and keep hold of it, be they other public agencies, be they individuals and families? Or is my job here, is my power, this wonderful power I have, to actually give away power and allow people and empower them to get on and sort it out for themselves, whether they're individuals, families, communities, other more local bodies, letting people getting on with it. Is that my mission? And if our job in the next few years, our conversation together is how do we all give away these powers and how do we help people flourish? That feels to me like a kind of good reason to kind of come together. Thank you.
An interesting point I wanted to raise with everyone in this instance is how I go about my day job. Imagine I'm still in the media, and how I did my day job when I first came to the Press Gallery in the late 80s, early 90s. Now, we've just been talking about giving away power and about a more collaborative approach. When I first arrived in the Press Gallery, that's what everybody did. There was a greater share of information. Journalist at my level, entry level in the Press Gallery at age 24 to do economics for the morning newspapers for the News Limited Bureau, which about 1.5 million readers all up. You had to get to know all the public servants in your area, Treasury, Finance, advisors across both sides of politics. Oh, I'm sorry. That's because I have to lean in. Okay, so when I first started work, the idea that the journalist and the public servant had a shared conversation going, an ongoing conversation going, was considered part of the job. And the public service was expected in those days to explain government policy after it was released. Now, something has gone missing, and I think in the intervening 10 or 20 years. And if I was still in the media today, I'd be reacting more than I would have in the past. I'd have been dealing with a culture that is less patient and more polarised, and I would have been dealing with an electorate that is much more fragmented than when I started out in journalism. Now, the reason why these things are important, and it's important, I think, to the public sector to understand the change in the culture that we've had over the last 20 or so years. You can't recreate my working experience in the late 80s. You can't get back the thing that we had when I first started journalism, which is a very, very big mainstream media with its respect levels up to here, not down to there where they are now. Critical mass in the reporting floor, and the ability of a journalist like me to spend 20 years on the job getting to know everybody in the business. Now, the media as it operates today is obviously in structural decline. Now, the structural decline in the media can be ignored, but I'd recommend that you don't ignore it. What's happened, though, in the intervening 10 of this 20-year cultural shift that we've been observing is that governments have have watched the media lose its respect and its authority and thought that we can bypass it. Now, that obviously, for the working journalist, sets up a whole lot of other incentives. If a government doesn't think it needs to come through me to explain its policies, if a government thinks that the technology permits it to release policies out into the wider community without prior consultation with the journalist, well, all well and good if the policy itself that's been developed has been properly thought through. What I've observed in the last 10 or so years, and this is one of the things that's made me grumpy as a journalist in the more recent time, is this rather bizarre risk aversion culture I've observed between government and its relationship with public sector and the public sector's relationship with the media, and through us, obviously, our engagement with the public. The risk aversion works this way. In the past, in the 80s and 90s, there'd be a massive consultation and collaborative effort would occur. Journos would be worded up about what the government was working on. A government would explain what the problem was. You'd have consultation with stakeholders, you'd have maybe a draft paper released about the policy, and then you'd sit back and you'd wait for the policy itself to be released. By the time the policy itself was released, a lot of the problems in the policy itself that might offend this or that group had already been aired in the problem identification and consultation process. We spent less time in those days worrying about how the thing might be implemented because that was a job for government and the community. The media basically ducked out of that discussion and went into another discussion, which was, well, what's the next big idea you've got? Now, because that part of it has been bypassed, we've been bypassed at that end, what you're getting is a lot more policy developed in secret, without prior knowledge for the media, dumped on the public without prior knowledge, and the media's incentives have changed. Because we haven't been let in on the way through, we're less able to interpret the thing. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look for the first person that says no. And I've been talking about this for a few years now. This thing is now past the point of it being contentious as the issue. I think this is the issue. Now, what I wanted to offer you is maybe a suggestion of how this thing might be fixed now, because I don't want to give you another end of the reform era talk. I want you to consider what technology actually permits the public service to do, how a public service might return to first principles. The thing that your ministers haven't been able to get their heads around yet is that the more they control the information on the development of public policy, the less control they have over the reception to that particular policy. Because they're delivering these things on a take it or leave it basis, there is not much intelligence being gathered on the way through about how this thing might work. Now, the public sector obviously wants to continue to operate within government, providing advice, being able to tell truth to power, with confidentiality respected. I'm not saying give me more stories. In fact, I'm saying the contrary. I'd rather you didn't leak. But what I would want you to consider is now, given where the technology is at the moment, given that you can't come through a journalist like me as you might have 10 or 20 years ago, that's no reason to clam up and then wait for the government to sell the stuff that you're working on. At some point in the problem identification and consultation process, new technology allows you to bypass media, well then go and do it. I don't see why you wouldn't try to recreate the next version of this conversation. The technology has shifted, the relationships between media and power have shifted, but that doesn't mean that your responsibilities have changed one bit. Before you formulate public policy, you need to identify a problem and you need to get as much intelligence as you can from the real world before you start advising government. So, my recommendation, in a general sense, not in a specific sense, is at some point, at some layer of government, I'd like to see a minister empower the public service to have a crack at a bit more of an open consultation process. Now, I'll tell you what happens to the media at that point, because people will tweet and people will direct us to their websites. I'll actually be better informed without these one-on-one conversations. So you don't need to report to your minister that you've spoken or had a cup of coffee with so-and-so, because that's kind of not your job anyway. But at some level, because I'm operating at a different speed now as a journalist, that information is still out there. In the past, I had to have a physical conversation. In the 21st century, I may need to find this out other ways. Now, I don't actually think that that's such a difficult thing for people to get their heads around. What's actually happened at government level on both sides of politics is this risk aversion, which actually increases the danger of public policy failing after it's been released. I'll give you the three examples, which we could all do off the top of our heads. Work choices delivered on a take it or leave it basis after the 2004 election. No prior conversation about what the nature of the problem the government wanted to solve was. 1,000 pages worth of legislation, a half-day lock-up for the media on a Saturday. How is that ever going to work? The mining tax. Big consultation process with the Henry Review, about 6 months worth, but then for 6 months the Rudd Swan government, as it was then, because Wayne Swan as Treasurer had carriage of this thing, not a peep out of them for 6 months. And then a 20-odd page booklet was released on the day, and you had to do that on a take it or leave it basis. In fact, the kinks in that particular mining tax proposal, there was only one really big one. With a bit of information at the start of the year, we might have avoided the catastrophe in the middle of the year. Now, as I say, I remember how it used to work, but I'm saying you can't recreate the past because you can't get another 200 reporters back into every newsroom in the country to be able to liberate all your specialist journalists. Like, as I said, we're all operating at a different speed. But the other example, and I like quoting this and I like to remind people of this, the number of pages the Australian produced for its lift out for the mining tax in 2010 was identical to the number of pages it produced for the new tax system in 1998. But if you ever get a chance, you might want to go to a library to check this out one day. If you look at the content of those two lift outs, a completely different story. The 2010 package had a lot of commentary, instant analysis, and then on the bottom of page 2, it had where you could hear Paul Kelly, Dennis Shanahan, myself, David Uran and a few other people, because then we were going to go to 7:30 report, late line, we were going to live blog and do about 600 other things. We actually didn't have that much explaining how this thing worked because we had no prior knowledge. We had a little bit, but I'm not pretending we didn't have any prior knowledge at all, but this thing was delivered on a take it or leave it basis. In 1998, and I know because I produced both lift outs, because the discussion had been going for a year and a half beforehand, months out from the release of the tax package, I lined up for each page a vested interest who could give me an informed reaction on the spot to a particular piece of the package. And John Howard and Peter Costello didn't mind that we were doing that in the past because back then, because people didn't mind, people still operated under the old rules. Now, I suspect that what's happened with the internet is the idea that all this extra information is out there has compelled politicians to go into the defensive crouch to try and control as much as possible. They worry about leaks, They worry about too much information being dumped on them before they're ready to talk. Now, I suspect, and they actually, by the way, they then say to the public service, you're not helping us explain this policy anymore, whilst they don't let you actually engage with the community on the way through. I suspect the simple parts of preparing policy, identifying problem, preparing, consulting, delivering document, implementing, I suspect that that system has never changed. I suspect that there is that the sort of those iron laws of human nature about how long it takes for a community to recognise a problem and accept what it is you're trying to do to fix it, I don't think those timelines have changed. Internet's compressed everything and created, I think, a false sense of information. Now, what I would prefer to see in the development process is a little more transparency, and I think you'd be pleasantly surprised if on the way through a lot more of the ideas that have been kicked around internally start to find their way out into the real world. You'd be pleasantly surprised how intelligent the electorate will be. And one other thought I just want to leave you with, because we are encouraging questions. Something to bear in mind about what's changed in the other thing to bear in mind what's changed in the culture in the last 10 or 20 years is the electorate itself. So when we say we've got less patience and we're more polarised and people in the media have less time to think and they've been forced to choose sides, and we've had the media wars begin in the last little while, you know, News Limited versus ABC and Fairfax trying to pick a fight with either of them to get noticed. I'm going to read you out the winning primary votes for each change of government since the end of the Second World War. And you'll understand why your ministers freak out the minute they get into power. 1949, Menzies got in with 50.3% primary vote. 72, Gough got in with 49.6%. Basically no statistical difference between those two. Half the electorate gave a primary vote to the winning party. 75, Fraser got 53.1. 83, Hawke got 49.5. Note, it hasn't changed yet. 96, it starts to slip. Howard gets in with 47.3 and is re-elected with less than 40% in his second term. 2007, Rudd gets in with 43.4 and Julia Gillard gets minority government with 38 at the second term. Tony Abbott has just come in at 45.6%, which is the lowest entry vote for a Conservative Party at a primary vote level in the history of Australian politics. Kevin Rudd obviously came in 2007 with the lowest entry vote in the history of politics from the Labor side. The electorate today is roughly 30% rusted on Labor, 30% rusted on Coalition, with 40% swinging in the middle. In the glory days, in the 80s when I first started journalism, it was 40-40 with a swinging centre of 20. When you've got 40% volatility electorate from issue to issue, that's what's flipping your ministers out. I suggest the advice you give them all individually, and of course we're not filming this, is tell them to relax and maybe let a bit more out, and they'll be less surprised by the outcome when they do announce policy. Thank you.